seriously popular.
Welcome to the Trial Podcast, The Inquiry. I'm Caroline Cheetham.
And I'm Liz Hull.
We'll be back in a second.
I make it absolutely clear that it's not for me as chair of this public
The decision
inquiry.
to move Letby to day shifts raises serious questions which we will be investigating. Was there a cover-up? If so, why?
I would pray for God to save her. He did. He saved
The
her.
convictions stand.
But the devil found her.
In August 2023, a neonatal nurse called Lucy Letby was convicted of killing and harming 13 babies in her care. She was sentenced to 14 life terms and declared one of the country's most prolific serial killers. A year later, she was convicted of attempting to kill another baby and given another life sentence.
All this happened in the Countess of Chester Hospital over the course of a year from 2015 to 2016. But what went wrong? Who knew what and when? How was a nurse able to kill and hurt babies on a ward under the noses of her colleagues?
The Thirlwall inquiry is now underway in Liverpool and will attempt to answer these questions and more. We'll be there covering events every day. Well, we told you that we would be back as soon as we had any kind of update on Lucy Letby's defence case. And that, of course, happened this week at a press conference which was held in London on Tuesday. Now, shortly before that press conference, her barrister, Mark Macdonald, submitted an application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission to challenge her convictions. Now, he'd originally said he was going to go directly to the Court of Appeal with this application because he said the situation was so extraordinary. But instead, he's gone down the more traditional route of the CCRC. They've confirmed to us the application is now with them and they won't be providing any sort of time frame for what happens next. But what Mr. Macdonald says is the substance of that application was unveiled at this press conference on Tuesday. So today, we just wanted to walk you through what was said, what it means, and what might happen now. And we'll be joined shortly by Lord Ken Macdonald, who's a lawyer and a barrister. He was also the former Director of Public Prosecutions, which essentially is the most senior prosecutor in the country. So he knows his onions when it comes to the law, and he's got a really interesting take on all of this. For now, though, as we say, we're just going to walk you through what we heard in this press conference. It was detailed, it was technical, it was full of complex medical terminology, but it was also an important moment in this case. So we're going to do our best to simplify it. And we've also taken a couple of days to dig back into the details of what took place during the trial, just to compare that with what is now being said. So, Liz, let's start with who was on the panel.
Yeah, okay. So there was David Davis MP, who was the chair, and he was joined by Lucy Letby's new barrister, like you said, Caroline, Mark Macdonald. There was also an eminent professor and neonatologist called Dr. Shu Lee, and the former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, Professor Nina Modi. She too was on the panel. Now, it's worth mentioning that she was actually the head of the Royal College when they did that review into the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, when the paediatricians were raising concerns back in 2016. The Royal College have since apologised for how they carried out that review, and it's been accepted at the public inquiry that there were mistakes in what they did. In fact, they've admitted that the review should never have been carried out at all when the review team heard about the doctor's suspicions. And they've accepted that their report could never have got to the bottom of how the babies died. Instead, as we've heard at the public inquiry, all the report did was give false reassurance to hospital management that Lucy Letby wasn't to blame for the deaths. And effectively, they used it to discredit the doctors and delay the police being called in for many, many months. But back to the press conference, Dr. Lee told the room, which was packed full of journalists, that he'd assembled 14 international experts who'd been involved in reviewing the medical notes of the 17 babies who are at the centre of this case. They've now compiled what he called an impartial evidence-based report. We're also told that they've reviewed the babies' medical notes over several days without being paid.
Yeah, and we should add really that Dr. Shuley is significant to this case, not just because of his background in neonatology, but because it was his report from 1989 into air embolus, which was referred to by the prosecution during Lucy Letby's original trial. Now, he was never called to give evidence during that trial, but he was asked by her defence team to give evidence to the appeal court because he had concerns about the way his research had been used to suggest that she'd injected air into the babies to kill them. But significantly, the Court of Appeal refused to allow his testimony to be considered. What they said was this wasn't fresh evidence because there was no reasonable explanation why it wasn't called at the trial. So he said that after Lucy Letby's appeal was dismissed by the Court of Appeal, he went away and he convened this international panel to examine the babies' cases more closely. And he said in the press conference that he'd told Lucy Letby and her team that this report would be released regardless of whether the findings were favourable to her or not. So that just gives a bit of the background to all of this. Let's just start then with how Dr. Shuley opened the press conference.
We understand their stress and their anguish, and our work is not meant to cause more distress. Rather, it is meant to give them comfort and assurance in knowing the truth about what really happened. We know that they want to know the truth, and that is why we are here, to tell the truth.
We'll come shortly to the reaction of the families of the babies to what happened during the press conference a bit later, but we should first outline what we heard. And I suppose, in a nutshell, this expert panel are saying they don't believe there were any crimes here. They say there's no evidence to suggest murder or attempted murder. They say it's their belief that the babies died or collapsed because of natural causes, because they were vulnerable due to their prematurity, because they'd been born with existing conditions like infections, and because in some of the cases they'd received poor treatment and care. Let's just hear another clip from Dr. Lee before we get into the detail.
Our conclusions of this panel, therefore, was that there was no medical evidence to support malfeasance causing death or injury in any of the 17 cases in the trial. Death or injury of all the affected infants were due either to natural causes or to errors in medical care. There were serious problems related to medical care of patients at this hospital. There were problems related to teamwork and interdisciplinary collaboration at the Countess of Chester Neonatal Unit. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, we did not find any murders. In all cases, death or injury were due to natural causes or just bad medical care.
Okay, so Dr. Lee then began getting into the detail of the summary report, which focused on 7 of the babies who had distinct causes of death, according to the prosecution at the trial. Now, anyone who's followed this case or our podcast will know the babies can't be named for legal reasons, and they've always been referred to by letters, babies A to Q. But for some reason in the press conference, they were referred to by numbers by Dr. Lee. So we'll just try to make sure that you know which babies he's referring to as we go through it. So let's start with baby A, who was referred to as baby 1. He was a twin, and Lucy Letby was convicted of his murder. Now, during the trial, we were told that he had collapsed very suddenly, and he had these sort of flitting patches of skin discoloration on his tummy, which for quite some time baffled the doctors at the hospital. And it was only when the consultant, Dr. Ravi J. Ram, saw Dr. Lee's report into air embolism over a year later, which described this skin discoloration or rash that he'd seen on baby A, that he started to have some concerns about it. Now, the allegation which the jury accepted was that Lucy Letby deliberately injected air into his veins, which caused that air embolus. Dr. Lee, though, said his report had been misinterpreted, and he also said that he'd now updated that original report. He now says when air is injected into the veins, there's no patchy skin discoloration, and he said the notion that baby A and other babies in this case could be diagnosed with air embolism because of this rash had no basis in fact. So effectively, he's changed and updated his own report twice.
So in terms of how he now says baby A died, he said the panel had ruled out air embolism and instead concluded his death was in fact caused by a blood clot. He said baby A's mother had a medical condition which could trigger blood clots, which had been passed on to her baby. He also said that on the day of baby A's collapse, there was a problem with one of his IV lines, which was giving him fluids. The line was removed and replaced, but there was then a 4-hour delay before the infusion was started. Dr. Lee said this wasn't best practice, as it could cause clots to form. And of course, he said this baby was already prone to clots due to his mum's condition. He said he believed that a clot had formed on the end of this line, and when the infusion eventually began, the clot was dislodged. He said it most likely travelled to his brain, causing him to collapse and die. So Dr. Lee concluded baby A died from natural causes.
Now, we should just point out here that this issue of this delay in baby A receiving the fluids and his mother's blood clotting condition was discussed at the trial, and the experts at Alder Hey Hospital in Liverpool and at Great Ormond Street in London concluded it couldn't be passed on to her children, so it was irrelevant to what happened.
We also know the expert radiologist from Great Ormond Street, Professor Owen Arthurs, who gave evidence for each baby in the case, also discovered an unusual line of gas close to baby A's spine on an X-ray taken after his death, which he said was consistent but not diagnostic of air being administered into his blood.
So Dr. Lee then moved on to baby D, who he referred to as baby 4. Now, she was born after her mother's waters broke when she was 37 weeks pregnant, and we know she went to hospital, but as her contractions hadn't started, she was sent home. But she wasn't given antibiotics. And it was 60 hours later when her daughter was born by emergency C-section. And she was a poorly baby from the minute she was born. She was pale and she was floppy. And ultimately, she was intubated and put on a ventilator to help her to breathe. But she did appear to stabilise, and then she suddenly collapsed 3 times because the prosecution said during the trial that Lucy Letby had injected her with air. She died in the early hours of June the 22nd in 2015, and the jury convicted Lucy Letby of her murder.
But again, Dr. Lee said her death was due to natural causes, and the fact that her mum hadn't been given antibiotics after her waters broke was significant. He also said baby D was not a stable baby as the prosecution had claimed. He said she was born with pneumonia, and a 4-hour delay in recognising her breathing difficulties and administering her antibiotics contributed to her deterioration and sudden death the following day. She also had an unusual rash on her belly, but he said this was not due to an air embolism, but instead had been caused by her infection getting out of control and triggering a clotting problem with her blood. He concluded she died from systemic sepsis and pneumonia. Now, again, these issues, such as the failure to deliver antibiotics to baby D's mum, the fact that she'd been born with pneumonia and had not received appropriate care for 4 hours after birth, were all rigorously tested in court by Lucy Letby's barrister, Ben Myers KC. He questioned the doctors on duty and the prosecution's medical experts in front of the jury. They heard evidence that baby D's post-mortem showed no evidence of sepsis, and in fact tests suggested her lung infection was improving because she'd been taken off a ventilator and her breathing support had been reduced in the hours before she suddenly collapsed and died. The other thing raised at the trial was Professor Arthurs had seen an unusual line of gas or air close to her spine as well when he examined x-rays taken after her death.
So next, Dr. Lee spoke about baby G, who he referred to as baby 7. Now, we know that she was born very prematurely in a toilet bowl at Arrow Park Hospital when her mother went into labour at just 23 weeks pregnant. She was tiny and she had many problems in the first few weeks of her life, including chronic lung disease, kidney and bowel problems, infections, jaundice, high blood sugar. She also had a serious bleed on one of her lungs. And in fact, at least 5 times in those early days, her parents were warned that she might not make it. So there's no question she was poorly and she was fragile. But when she was 13 weeks old, she was well enough to be transferred from Arrow Park to the Countess of Chester to be closer to home. However, After she was moved, she deteriorated suddenly on several occasions and she projectile vomited. And you may not remember this, but during the trial, there was a photograph issued by the court of her cot and a mark on the floor and a chair quite a distance away, just to demonstrate how far that vomit had travelled. Now, the prosecution case was that Lucy Letby had tried to kill baby G 3 times by overfeeding her with milk and pumping air into her feeding tube. Now, the jury found her guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder, but cleared her of the 3rd count.
But Caroline, Dr. Lee disagreed with this. He said baby G had many chronic problems and she had a probable viral infection on the first night that she collapsed. She had vomited, but she also had watery stools, which he said are not consistent with overfeeding. And he said there was no evidence to support the theory that air had been forced into her tummy or that she'd been overfed. But again, we should point out that the issue of whether she had an infection and whether this caused her collapse was discussed at length before the jury. In fact, Mr. Myers suggested that blood tests showed it was that infection that caused her to vomit and to deteriorate. Now, of course, we know the prosecution's expert, Dr. Dowie Evans, disagreed. He said the infection only developed after she'd been force-fed a massive amount of milk. He said the infection was a consequence and not the cause of her collapse.
Next, Dr. Lee turned to baby I, who he said died of natural causes. He referred to her as baby 9, and he said she was preterm. Actually, we know she was born at just 27 weeks at Liverpool Women's Hospital in the summer of 2015. And when she was 6 weeks old, she was transferred to the Countess, which again was closer to her parents' home. Now, during the trial, we were told that baby I was progressing well. But in September, she had a swollen tummy in the hours before she collapsed. The prosecution said during the trial, this was because Lucy Letby was pumping air into her tummy via the tube which was feeding her. Now, they alleged that she attacked her in the same way 3 times over the next few weeks until she killed her on the 4th attempt by injecting air into her bloodstream at the end of October. And the jury convicted Lucy Letby of the murder of baby I.
Yeah, but Dr. Lee said the experts who'd reviewed her notes said she was extremely premature with many, many health conditions. He said a bacterial infection had been found in her breathing tube that was resistant to antibiotics, and that had interfered with her ventilation and breathing. She also likely had sepsis or an intolerance to milk, he said, which was why her tummy was swollen. And the only reason X-rays showed air in her stomach was because they'd been taken after she was resuscitated. He said the doctors had failed to treat her for the infection, and he says she died from respiratory complications caused by respiratory distress syndrome and chronic lung disease, which were due to her prematurity. He also said her death was preventable. But again, we should point out here that the suggestion that baby I had an infection before she died was discussed at the trial, and much of Mr. Myers' cross-examination of the doctors and nurses who treated her and the prosecution's expert witnesses all centred around her being this really fragile baby and one that was fighting those different problems that she'd been born with. Mr. Myers said this may well have made her death inevitable.
Yes, so then Dr. Lee focused on baby K, who he referred to as baby 11. And you will probably remember that Lucy Letby was tried twice for the attempted murder of baby K because the jury initially failed to reach a verdict the first time round. Now, she was convicted after the second trial. So just to remind you, baby K was one of the most premature babies involved in the case. She was born at just 25 weeks. She survived her birth, and 11 hours later, she was transferred to another hospital for more specialist care, but she died there 3 days later. And the prosecution case during the trials was that Lucy Letby tried to murder her at the Countess less than 2 hours after she was born because she dislodged her breathing tube.
But Dr. Lee said the issue was baby K's breathing tube was only inserted after what he called several traumatic attempts. And he said that because the doctors had used a breathing tube that was too small, this had caused a 94% air leak. In other words, she wasn't getting enough oxygen to help her breathe. He also said the wrong equipment had been used when she collapsed, so her lungs had failed to properly inflate. He said the tube hadn't been dislodged, but it was actually in the wrong place, and he accused the consultant, Dr. Ravi Jairam, of not knowing what he was doing. He also said the allegation that the alarm on the incubator had been deliberately switched off had been contradicted by another nurse who said she'd heard it.
Yeah, again, all of these issues were aired before both juries, but particularly at the retrial when the second jury heard an awful lot of detailed evidence about that breathing tube. And yes, ideally, a slightly bigger tube would have been inserted the first time round.
Yeah, they also heard the conflicting evidence about the alarm, and they were told about the tube being found in the wrong place another 2 times. But they accepted that this was because Lucy Letby had moved it deliberately to cover her tracks.
So another baby Dr. Lee referred to was baby O. Now, he was one of the 3 identical triplet brothers who were born a minute apart at just over 33 weeks by C-section in June 2016. And you will remember that they were incredibly rare because they shared a placenta. Now, he was doing well until he was 2 days old when he collapsed really suddenly. His tummy was swollen, and a post-mortem showed he'd also suffered a significant injury to his liver, which caused internal bleeding. Now, Lucy Letby had just come back from her holidays and was in charge of looking after baby O when this happened. She was accused and convicted of injecting air into his tummy and into his bloodstream and inflicting that liver injury.
Yeah, but at the press conference, Dr. Lee said that there was another explanation for this damage to the liver. He said it had been caused at birth by his rapid delivery. He said that when the triplets were born via C-section, they were delivered very quickly, a minute apart, and this had caused a liver hematoma. Baby O's collapse several days later was due to the hematoma rupturing, he said, causing major internal bleeding. He said the fact his brother, baby P, also had a similar liver injury supported his theory that damage had been caused as a result of their birth.
Yeah, Dr. Lee also said there was serious bleeding inside the liver, and in addition, in his view, the wrong technique had been used to resuscitate baby O when he collapsed. He said the consultant, in this case, the head of the unit, Dr. Stephen Breary, had blindly inserted a needle into the baby's abdomen as part of that resuscitation, and the doctors hadn't recognised the liver injury caused during the birth or that baby O was in profound shock. He said there was no evidence that air had been injected into baby O.
And again, during the trial, this liver injury was discussed at length before the jury, and the main evidence was actually given by an expert pathologist called Professor Andreas Marnarides from Guy's Hospital in London. He said a huge area of bruising had been found on baby O's liver at the post-mortem, and it was not probable that it had been caused by forceful CPR. He also said it was extremely unlikely the damage had been caused by a needle because there was no evidence of a perforation injury.
And actually, Liz, this was something that we asked ourselves during the trial and that was explored by the defence. How was baby O's liver so bruised? Yet there was no real obvious bruising on the external outside, on the skin. And Professor Marnarides said it was very common to see the most devastating internal injury, even when nothing is visible on the skin from the outside.
Yes, and he also said that he'd only ever seen such an injury in cases where children had been involved in road traffic accidents or if they'd fallen off a trampoline. There was never any suggestion put to him at the trial that the injury could have been caused at birth. In baby O's case, Professor Arthurs also found unusual amounts of air in his stomach and bowel, which he said was more than expected in a normal baby.
Finally, Dr. Lee addressed one of the babies who Lucy Letby was convicted of poisoning with insulin by tampering with the bags of nutrients which were feeding him. Now, this was baby F, who was referred to as baby 6. Now, he was a premature twin born in August 2015, and the prosecution case was he was stable and doing well until suddenly his heart rate surged and his blood sugar crashed to what was called dangerously low levels. He was given repeated doses of dextrose, but his blood sugar failed to pick up, and eventually he recovered, but a test carried out later appeared to indicate that the insulin causing his blood sugar to crash was not being produced by his own body, but had come from an external source. Now, the prosecution case was that this was because Lucy Letby had put the insulin into bags of nutrients which he'd been receiving via a drip. Essentially, the jury convicted her of attempting to murder him by poisoning him.
Now, the science here is a little bit complicated, but essentially, Dr. Lee said baby F's low blood sugar was not treated properly at the beginning by the medical team, which is why they couldn't stabilise him. He also said the tests used to evidence whether insulin had been introduced externally, rather than being made naturally in his body, had been misinterpreted. He said his insulin levels were within a normal range for premature babies, and so the results didn't prove that external or exogenous insulin was used to poison him. He also made the point that his insulin expert is an engineer called Professor Jeff Chase, who he said had been studying this his whole life. But it's also worth reminding people listening, Caroline, that the prosecution's insulin expert was a professor called Peter Hindmarsh, who's a specialist in paediatric endocrinology at Imperial College in London.
Okay, so that's what Dr. Lee said about the individual cases. He said the panel had examined all the 17 babies involved in the original trial, and for each baby, their conclusion was the same. There was no evidence, he said, of malfeasance or foul play. In other words, Lucy Letby, he said, hadn't murdered or harmed any children. Now, he also had some pretty scathing words to say about the hospital and the medical staff. He said they'd misdiagnosed diseases and provided poor care. He said they didn't understand basic resuscitation and that they'd been caring for babies which were beyond their ability. He also said there were unsafe delays in diagnosis and treatment, poor supervision of junior doctors, and a lack of teamwork and trust between healthcare professionals. In fact, this is what he said.
I would say that if this was a hospital in Canada, it would be shut down.
So obviously that's a very, very damning statement, but we should add here that while there were some problems on the unit, you might remember, Caroline, the review by the Royal College highlighted issues with staffing, relationships between the senior nurses and consultants, the number of ward rounds that the consultants did every week, and those delays in transferring babies to more specialist hospitals. But the review didn't suggest, actually, that there were any problems with the actual medical care given to these children. In fact, the report said the paediatricians were a cohesive team and the training for junior doctors was good.
Yeah, and we also know that in the 5 years before 2015, there were only 2 or 3 deaths a year on the unit. That jumped to 8 in 2015, and from January to June 2016, it was 5. Now, we also know that Lucy Letby was on duty or had just clocked off for all but one of those 13 deaths. And of course, after she was moved off frontline nursing duties, the deaths stopped altogether. And all the while, over that period, the other staff, the team of doctors and nurses, largely, well, it remained the same. So Dr. Lee said his summary would now be sent to Lucy Letby's legal team and on to the CCRC. It will then be up to them to decide whether what the new experts say is fresh or new and whether it meets their test of determining whether there is a real possibility of the Court of Appeal deciding Lucy Letby's convictions are unsafe and overturning them.
So, Caroline, what we've tried to do is look at what Dr. Lee had to say this week and then go back over all our trial notes to compare what was said then. It would have been impossible to do that in real time in that pretty intense press conference. So it's taken us a few days just to go over everything to try and paint a fuller picture. What's clear is the medical opinions presented on Tuesday are just that, opinions. They've not been challenged in court. And of course, that was the main criticism of Lucy Letby's original defence, that for whatever reason, Ben Myers didn't call his own medical experts to challenge those of the prosecution.
Yeah, and it's also only right to point out, as Ken Macdonald will shortly in our interview, that Dr. Lee's panel of medical experts are effectively looking at the medical notes of the babies and coming to medical explanations for why they might have died. But medical evidence was one part of the case against Lucy Letby. It was not the totality. And it goes back to what the prosecution barrister, Nick Johnson KC, told the jury in his closing speech. And that was the power of circumstantial evidence and what he called context. How he said it wasn't possible to pick at individual pieces of evidence when considering whether Lucy Letby was guilty, and he urged them to look at the whole picture, the entire jigsaw puzzle, if you like, as well as the medical evidence.
Yes, so you'll remember that he asked them to think about things like the notes she wrote, why she'd taken home more than 250 handover sheets and put them under her bed, why she'd written the initials of the triplets in her diary on the day they'd died, why the babies seemed to collapse on significant milestones, such as Father's Day or their due date, or on the day they were supposed to be going home, why they fell ill when she was alone with them, when their parents had nipped away to get some food, or while their designated nurse was on a break, why she took and kept a photo of a sympathy card she sent to baby I's parents on her mobile phone for years, or why she'd searched for the parents on Facebook many weeks, months, and even years after their children died.
Yeah, and of course the jury also listened to the testimony of many of Lucy Letby's colleagues, the doctors and the nurses who worked with her, who described how she was competent, diligent, but how she sometimes behaved oddly when babies collapsed or died. And of course, crucially, the jury heard from Lucy Letby herself. She gave evidence in the witness box for a long time, 2 weeks, in fact. They had 60 hours to watch her, to listen to her, and to make up their own minds about whether this was an innocent coincidence or not, that she was on duty when the babies collapsed, and if she'd been scapegoated by these doctors who conspired to blame her, to try to deflect attention from their own shortcomings and the failings at the hospital, which was an argument that Ben Myers made incredibly strongly on her behalf during the trial. We'll take a quick break there. Okay, so Liz, just before we go into our interview with Ken Macdonald, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, we wanted to have a word about the families of the babies who've already been through so much for many, many years. Now, we heard at the top that Dr. Lee said he did not want to cause them any more distress and that the panel simply wanted to get to the truth. But, you're in touch with some of these families, and it's fair to say this was really, really difficult and upsetting for them.
Yeah, so Caroline, we heard from their barristers at the public inquiry that the families have been left devastated by this constant debate, all the conspiracy theories, the noise around Lucy Letby's convictions. Richard Baker KC, in his opening statement to the inquiry, said the parents have sat through the trial, 2 trials in the case of baby Kay's mum and dad, and that they've got no doubts about her guilt. He talked about the fact that they're anonymous and that this has led to their dehumanisation in the eyes of the public, which has, he said, created an environment where people feel able to express, vile comments, air their opinions about them on social media. So it's not really surprising that very few of them want to speak out publicly. But one mum was so furious about what she saw at that press conference that she was brave enough to talk to me. She said she'd watched it in disgust, really. She said it was disrespectful and upsetting. And the fact that it was held live and the panel used numbers to talk about their children and to cast doubt on Lucy Letby's convictions and what happened to their babies was really, really upsetting. She said Dr. Lee talked about getting to the truth, but she was pretty insistent that the families already know the truth. She said she believed in the justice system and that the jury made the right decision. Ultimately, she said the people on the panel don't speak for us.
Okay, so as promised at the top of the episode, we did manage to catch up with Lord Ken Macdonald after that press conference. He's the former Director of Public Prosecutions. You might know that he also presents his own podcast with his friend and barrister Tim Owen KC, who's been on our podcast many times. Their one, which we love, is called Double Jeopardy, the Law and Politics podcast. We can really recommend it, and we can recommend the chat that we had with Lord Ken Macdonald. Lord Ken Macdonald, thank you so much for joining us. Hugely appreciate your time. I wonder whether we could start, first of all, just with your reaction to that press conference on Tuesday. I think you were watching it, you're across what was happening from a legal standpoint anyway. What was your reaction to what you heard?
I mean, it's quite an unusual tactic they're using here, Lucy Letby's new lawyers, of playing everything out in public. This isn't the first press conference they've had. I think during the first press conference, Mark MacDonald, her new barrister, was saying he was going to try and take the case directly back to the Court of Appeal, which would have been very challenging because the Court of Appeal has already dismissed her arguments. Yesterday, he said that the proposal is now to go to the CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which is the body that looks at possible miscarriages of justice. And actually, I think that was always the right approach. I don't know why he was talking about the Court of Appeal earlier. But the press conference itself was clearly interesting and important in some ways, simply for this reason, if none other. The people presenting their opinions are undoubtedly very senior, leading figures in the field of pediatric and neonatal health. They're people of real substance. And I don't think that David Davis was exaggerating really when he was stressing that. I mean, this is as qualified a group of scientists in this field as you could probably gather across the world. And all 14 of them seem to be clear that the medical evidence, the scientific evidence given in Lucy Letby's trial was flawed in one way or another. And their conclusion is that all of these deaths could be explained by natural causes or poor medical care. So that's something we have to look at seriously and consider seriously. I mean, people will make their own judgments about it.
From a legal standpoint, though, obviously what we've heard so far, just for people who may not know how the process works, because it is quite confusing, isn't it? It feels significant, of course. It feels compelling. You're absolutely right. But obviously the judgment for the Court of Appeal and the CCRC is it's got to be new, it's got to be fresh. So is that still the judgment they will take now?
I mean, this is quite an important part of the story, as you said. If an appeal is going to be brought, it has to be brought on the basis of fresh evidence. That means evidence that has arisen since the trial, that is new and compelling, and evidence that's fit to be considered by the Court of Appeal. And there will be an argument, I think, made by people that this evidence isn't fresh in that sense because it would have been available, was available, and could have been obtained by the defence at the time of the trial if they'd wanted to. The first stage for them is that they have to persuade the Criminal Cases Review Commission that this new material is sufficiently compelling that in the view of the Commission, there's a real possibility that the Court of Appeal would allow an appeal based on this new evidence. So that's the determination that the Criminal Cases Review have to come to. They have to, in a sense, predict what they think Court of Appeal judges would make of this evidence. And if they think there's a real possibility, Court of Appeal judges would say, blimey, this changes everything, we're going to allow this appeal. Then they have to refer it. If they don't think it falls into that category, then they won't refer it.
But David Davis did kind of refer to the problem that Lucy Letby's lawyers are going to have in the press conference, because I think he kind of talked about the Law Commission and a report that the Law Commission have been doing about how appeals and rules of appeals that stop defendants introducing evidence at appeal that they should have adduced at trial. He referred to that potentially being a problem.
So the rule really is, was this evidence available at the trial? If it was, conventionally, it won't be allowed to be heard in the Court of Appeal. And the reason for the rule is to stop people endlessly dragging up issues that should have been litigated in front of the jury. Otherwise, the courts would just lose control of the trial process. I mean, I think there's a good reason for that rule, and I don't think it's a bad rule. I mean, I guess one of the things that might happen here, speaking frankly, is that there's a lot of public interest in this case. The Criminal Cases Review Commission is under a lot of pressure at the moment because it's performed very poorly in recent years and failed to pick up some very notable miscarriages of justice, like the case of Andrew Malkinson, the man who served 17 years for a rape he didn't commit, failed appallingly by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. I mean, that and the CCRC's chair has just resigned as a result of all that. That context might mean that it's more likely to refer this case than it would otherwise be. I mean, that's not really a proper consideration for them to take into account, but we're all human. There's a lot of pressure. They may just say to themselves, well, this is just such a hot potato. We'll let the Court of Appeal sort it out. In essence, I mean, they would never articulate it that way, but that's where we may end up. So I think the reality is that if the judges were persuaded that this evidence was so compelling that it would lead them to overturn Lucy Letby's convictions, they would find some way to receive it and would receive it. I don't think we'd be in a situation where the Court of Appeal would just say, this evidence is not fresh evidence, so we're not even going to consider it. We're not going to look at it at all. I think what they do is they would say, we'll look at the evidence as part of our determination as to whether it's fresh evidence. And then if they thought the evidence did support an appeal, they would allow the appeal. If they thought it didn't, they'd probably criticize the evidence, explain why it doesn't work, and then say, in any case, it's not fresh evidence, so we wouldn't even have received it anyway in a full appeal. So they can have their cake and eat it, really. They look at the evidence properly, they give their reasons for rejecting it, and then they say, in any case, it's not even fresh evidence. I think that's the sort of process that they would undertake.
And of course, that's exactly what they did with Dr. Xu Li. In the original appeal, they listened to his evidence and then effectively said, well, actually, we don't think it's relevant, and dismissed it as part of the appeal.
Yeah, and I think they also indicated they didn't think it was really fresh evidence either, because the defence could have obtained it at the time. So I guess that's what they would do. I mean, I think it's quite interesting. You mentioned how they treated his evidence in the first appeal. I mean, one of the issues about all this is that these very eminent scientists are looking at very specific scientific problems and issues, which of course the jury had to do, but the jury had to do much more than that. They had to also factor in all the other evidence in the case, the extent to which she and she alone may have been the only person present at all the incidents, the note she kept at home saying, I'm evil, I did this, the mementos she took relative to the babies, the internet searches of the baby's parents, the sudden collapses, the collapse of, I think, on one occasion, 2 twins in very close time proximity to one another. There was a whole wealth of other evidence in this case that tended to confirm that foul play had been evident. And indeed, I think the defence accepted that in some of the cases, harm had been deliberately caused to these infants and babies. They were simply saying it wasn't Lucy Letby. So that's itself inconsistent with what we were being told yesterday by these scientists, which is that there was no foul play in any of these cases.
We also have to remember that the jury were the only ones that sat there every day through her defence and watched how she performed in the witness box. She gave evidence for a long time.
And she gave evidence for 2 weeks, I think. Yeah, I mean, criminal lawyers always say that it's an important part of a juror's task is to observe someone's demeanour. And obviously, people giving evidence, particularly in a case like that, can be nervous and upset and may not give a very good account of themselves for all sorts of reasons. But I think when someone's in the witness box for 2 weeks, horrible as though it must be for them, it does give the jury an opportunity to look very closely. And it's notable that the scientists who were giving their opinions weren't at the trial. We don't know how much of the transcripts they read, if any. We know they focused on the minutiae of the deaths and they looked at what might have caused those deaths. But they're looking at all that in isolation, really, with all of the other material held away and not factored in. And that means that what they're doing is very, very different from what the jury were doing.
I mean, just on that, Ken, one of the questions that was asked of the panel on Tuesday was, are there some trials that just are too technical, too scientific, too complicated to be put before ordinary members of the public in a jury? I think actually David Davis dismissed it to some extent because he was saying juries have been proven in the past to be very astute when they're deliberating and considering evidence. But even Tuesday's press conference was very technical. I've gone back and listened to it 3 times and sort of made loads and loads of notes. But actually, it's very technical. It's very medical. Do you think there is an argument that says some trials maybe are not the best put before a jury of ordinary people?
I think there is an issue here that we need to grapple with, and I think the Law Commission has been looking at this. I mean, as a barrister, I've been involved in trials in which some very, very technical evidence has been the main issue. I remember one case I did involving some IRA people who fired a mortar at a runway at Heathrow, and the real evidence against one of them was a soil sample taken from his shoe, which was said to match the field next door to the airport where the mortar was fired from. And it was incredibly technical evidence about the crystalline shape of minute particles of soil. I remember having to spend one of my weekends 12 hours a day with a soil expert from the University of Reading trying to understand all of this. And it was incredibly technical. So I think you're raising a very good question. On the other hand, I think David Davis is probably right. If cases are presented to juries properly, and if judges keep an eye on it to make sure that it's not going off into the Netherlands of incomprehensibility, I think juries do, by and large, get these cases right. But it certainly is an issue, and is certainly something we need to keep an eye on, so that the evidence is explained to juries in a way that's comprehensible. I mean, the situation here, of course, and absolutely startling and notable feature of this case is that the defense didn't call a scientific expert. So they sat through all of the prosecution science. The defense barrister for Lucy Letby cross-examined these experts and suggested all sorts of things to them, but then they didn't call their own expert. And that is something which has puzzled people ever since. I mean, there must have been a good reason for it. She had competent representation and she's never complained about her representation. But if you don't, I can tell you as someone who's defended in many cases over the years, if you're facing a scientific case and you don't call evidence of your own, it's either because you can't find any that helps you, or if you do find some experts that say they'll help you, it turns out their evidence is not going to help you, and that's why you don't call it. But there must have been a reason why her defense didn't call anyone, and until we know the reason for that, it's difficult to see how this material is fresh, why they didn't call any material, and what's the real status of this material now, which they want to call. And why didn't they call it before? I mean, these are all questions which will be going through the minds of the CCRC people. And indeed, if this case gets referred to the Court of Appeal, it'll be going through the minds of the Court of Appeal judges. And I suspect they'll want some answers.
And just to be clear on what happens then, if that happens, Ken. So if the CCRC say, I think there's something to be looked at here based on what we've heard, talk us through just briefly that process. It goes back to the Court of Appeal, and then what? Well,
then the Court of Appeal schedules a hearing. I guess the first thing it would want to consider was the admissibility of this material. In other words, is this fresh evidence, is the first question. And the second question, if it is, would be, is it compelling? Does it make us conclude that this conviction is now to be viewed as unsafe? And I suspect what they would do is they would treat their determination of the fresh evidence as a kind of full argument about the quality of the evidence as well, because I don't think they'd want to be in the position of saying, we're not even going to look at this, at the merits of this evidence, because it's not fresh evidence, because I think people would feel that was wrong. People would want to know whether the Court of Appeal felt that this evidence, if it was admitted, would cause them to allow her appeal. So I think they'll roll up both parts of that process into one. The admissibility question, is it fresh evidence? And the merits question, is it sufficiently compelling? I think they deal with all of that as part of the same process. I think that's what they do.
Okay, great.
Interesting. We will wait to see. Lord Ken Macdonald, thank you so much for joining us and talking us through the legal process of everything we're hearing. And I'm sure you're covering it on your podcast as well, are you, in the next coming days?
We are. We're recording an episode tomorrow talking about this very subject. So you'll probably get there before us, but anyone's interested, we've got a few episodes on Double Jeopardy focusing on the Lucy Letby case. So your listeners can listen to our podcast as well.
Okay, so there's a lot to take in there. We've tried our best to highlight what's been said this week in the context of what the jury heard during those two court cases. So please do let us know your thoughts. We'll continue to cover anything new which might happen in this case, but failing that, we'll be back as planned in March for the closing statements of the barristers at the Thirlwall inquiry. Don't forget, you can catch up with any previous episodes or listen to the other trials in our series, wherever you get your podcasts.
You can follow us at The Trial Pod on Instagram and on TikTok at Daily Mail Crime.
You can also leave a comment on Spotify or send us a voice note on WhatsApp on 07796 657 512. Start your message with the word crime.
See you then.